Okay. Hi, good morning, everyone. Such a wonderful group coming together. My name is Marcia Warren Edelman. I am a founding partner of Cultural Global Labs. We are an online, at least for the moment, until we can be in person, but an online learning community, which bridges intercultural communication with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and health and well-being. So we try to bring together these three areas in innovative ways through our interviews, our workshops, our online resources, and hoping really to foster a community of curious and interested folks that want to make a change in the world. Today we have a real treat. I am joined by two, not one but two, Chief Visionary Officers. Our very own Chief Visionary Officer, Aintimo Chimino, who many of you know, and another Chief Visionary Officer who's also a consultant with CGL, Dr. Joel A. Davis Brown. I'm reading the whole name from, from the Zoom link. And Dr. Brown is a Chief Visionary Officer of, I hope I'm saying this correctly, Numos LLC, is that correct? Okay. Management consulting, provides management consulting and coaching based in San Francisco, so coming to us from San Francisco today. And working really in the areas of cultural intelligence, leadership, change management, strategic storytelling. As a change agent, Joel works strategically with organizational leaders to cultivate innovative, creative, and adaptive environments where the cultural genius of everyone can be harnessed and leveraged successfully. So very excited to have this conversation. And we're going to be talking with Joel today to get a pulse check on the state of diversity, equity, and inclusion in his work, specifically, I think, with companies in the corporate arena. But we can expand that conversation whichever way Dr. Brown would like to take us today. And so before we start, I just want to give a little context as to why we wanted to do this pulse check. And I'm going to keep it brief because we're all living in the moments that I'm going to describe. So, 2020 has been a year. Yeah, it's been a year. It's a unique year in that this is a period of time in which the whole world has been experiencing very, very similar, if not the same, challenges. COVID-19, social change, a very strong focus and call to action on racial equity, experiencing racial violence, and the awareness, the greater awareness of the difference between marginalized communities and dominant culture and how all of these issues affect these communities, whether it's COVID, whether it's law enforcement, any kind of institutional, behavior, all of that. We all are coming to a greater level of awareness on this planet in terms of these issues. So for that reason, we really wanted to check in with Dr. Brown to get a sense of his reflections on what's happening today and how it's translating into the work that he does. So saying all that, I'd like to step back. I'm going to be your facilitator today. So I'm going to be kind of watching the chat room. Please come up with, if you have any questions that are coming up, please put them in the chat. We also are going to leave a lot of time at the end of the conversation so that you all can also talk to Dr. Brown and ask some questions that are coming up for you and the work that you do. But now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Aintimo. So thank you all for coming today.
Yeah, everyone, thank you so much for logging in. Wherever in the world you are, you're most welcome. It is a really treat to have Dr. Brown with us because he has been leading an organization that has done incredible work in this space, and I'm pretty sure he's been very, very busy. And it occurred to me that if we asked him what's really going on and what he's seeing on the ground with companies and individuals, that would actually learn and come away with a lot of insights. So, Dr. Brown, if you have anything else you want to add about your passion, please do so. And maybe we'll get started with one question afterwards to really share your observation about how leaders and organizations have been really reacting to the context that Marcia set up with us, for us, and especially in this country under this current landscape.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you to Marcia and Antimo for inviting me, and thank you for all of you for being here for the conversation. Feel free to just call me Joel. The reason why I was glad that the full name was read was not because of the doctor designation, but because of the Davis, because that's my mother's maiden name, and I wanted to make sure that I honored her and that side of my family when I expanded my name several years ago. So thank you for that. I also want to take time to honor the cultivators and caretakers of the land on which I sit. So this is Ohlone land, otherwise known as the city and county of San Francisco. So I want to say that. I'd also like to just take time to acknowledge all of the justice warriors across the world. So whether we're in Nigeria, whether we're in Belarus right now, whether we're talking about climate change, women's rights, Me Too, and certainly Black Lives Matter, I just want to make sure that we align ourselves in the context of the people who are fighting for justice and equity everywhere. Um, there was something that was really said that was interesting, that Marcia opened up our conversation by saying that, 2020 is a very interesting year. And of course it is because of COVID. And at the same time, I would say to you that a number of the things that have been highlighted this year are frankly not new. And I think we all hopefully know that, that the conversations that have been taking place this year have been taking place for a lifetime, for generations, for centuries, and going back hundreds and hundreds of years. And so I think it's important to state that from the outset, because I think if we do that, then it becomes easier for us to think about what's the current landscape. So it's a mixed bag. I mean, you have people who are trying to, and companies are trying to make up for lost time and lost ground. I would say, just in terms of what we've seen in our practice, our team straddles the globe. And so we have a team member in Nairobi in East Africa, we have team members in Toronto, and others across the continental United States. So what have we seen? We have seen some performative diversity, so the idea that people want to rush something through, they want to have some anti-racism training, um, but it's not really clear what their strategic objectives are, and more importantly, have they done the work to figure out why they were not activated until 2020? It should not take a man being murdered on video camera for people to realize the seriousness of ism. We've had some organizations that are engaged and do want to take it seriously, but have been very tepid, and they're not realizing that as leaders, or that the leaders within the organization have to do their own work as well. So what has happened is you hear people saying, "Well, I want to reach that group," and in the last 6 or 7 months has been African Americans, Blacks, people of color, BIPOC, BAME, however you want to designate that acronym, but being tepid, but also not realizing that there's an individual imperative for doing this work and doing it at a high level. And then you've had some who, the rest, who I would say are very much interested in thinking about how to do this strategically. As a consultant, the thing that I worry about is that even in this landscape, there are still a number of things that are frankly hurting consultants, and frankly hurting consultants of color, where we're being asked, for example, to partner with larger groups, where they might have, for example, the reputation or the prestige or the size. And there have been a number of organizations I know have approached ours, because we're a small but mighty firm. We have about 11 team members at current count. And we've had some organizations that have just said, well, could you work with us and help us to develop models, not being mindful of the fact that there's protected IP, and the fact that, we also have years of experience, and being open to taking direction from a firm that is smaller, but no less competent, no less capable. So those are some of the things that we're seeing there. And I think the question that I have for any company is, are you really serious, and do you understand what the work means? The work is by necessity means that you're going to be in a place of discomfort. It means that you have to be thinking differently and systemically and structurally, which means that we have to have conversations that we've not had before. And some organizations are not ready to have those conversations. And for those, we say thank you, but contact us when you're ready. But there are others who are. And I think, what is that conversation? That conversation is looking at the structural implications again of how this stuff manifests itself, and the fact that this is not um, new, and that this is separate from whether you like people, it's separate from whether you're a good person, it's separate from whether you intend any type of outcome or consequence. It's looking at the machine, and the machine is we're talking about white supremacy, we're talking about patriarchy, we're talking about heterosexism, we're talking about classism. We've got to be able to name those things, and we've got to be able to have those conversations. And when we can, I think we serve our populations better. I would also say to us, before we dig in a little bit deeper, people are tired of having conversations. And so what you're seeing is a number of companies, organizations that are having to play catch up while their population is frankly less patient because they've been making these demands for a while. So one of the dilemmas is, how do you create the space to educate the leadership even when they might be resistant or they might not be fully aware, but also to get some early wins and to create some early tangible deliverables so that people can start to see meaningful change. Because, to use the metaphor, if people's houses are on fire, they don't have time for you to be educated on how to use the hose. So these are the things that are going to be really important. These are the things that we're seeing, and also just the deluge of work. And once again, because a lot of organizations have neglected this work, it's now, let's hurry up and do this tomorrow, which also puts an unreasonable burden on a number of consulting firms to, try to be magicians. And we've had to slow walk a number of the initiatives that we've supported and say, this is not just a program. We don't have a programmatic focus. And if you're really going to do this work, you have to look at this for the lifeline of your organization. Are you ready to do that? If you are, great. And if not, then here's some things we want you to think about, and you probably should consider those and reflect before you come back to us and before you talk to any other consultancy that might be out there.
Wonderful. I wonder if you've been in a position where a small to mid-sized company has approached you for a type of intervention where it's clear that there is a disconnect between their strategy and alignment, leadership, and corporate culture. We've certainly had that, and it is one very challenging place because you would think that a smaller organization who's eager to grow would be more willing to actually listen to a consultant in doing it the right way, doing the right thing. Have you run into anything like that?
No, absolutely. And the area that, or the theme that comes up instantly for me is around, um, I call it this recruitment heavy focus.
Yeah.
So to say, okay, we got to get as, and I'm just going to be as frank and as real as I can be. We got to get as many BIPOC people into the company. And when I say BIPOC, for those of you who are not familiar with that terminology, because I know we have a global audience and I want to be inclusive, Black, Indigenous, or persons of color, or put a different way, minority ethnicity. So we got to get as many people who are underrepresented
Yeah.
into the company.
Yep.
And that's great. But if you haven't done the work to support the infrastructure, it's going to be a revolving door. And in fact, I would say to you, attend to that in some ways first before you go about recruiting so that you don't create more harm. And also, the challenge, of course, is there's such a focus on people who are not there that you ignore the people who are already within your pipeline who have talent, who have wisdom, and can give you a lot of insight as to how to make change. But you're ignoring them because there's this novelty of, we got to get more into the company. If we get more, then we've done our job. And that's one of the things that I've seen. And I also have seen other consultancies, frankly, that have resisted taking advice from someone who might be seen as a peer because they think that because they've done organizational work, they necessarily understand diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Yeah.
And the two are not the same. I think there is some overlap, and I think that there should be a blended focus, but they're not the same. And there have been a number of companies that have not made that connection. And so we're possible, we're receptive, we're open. We certainly have had those conversations and try to help people to understand what the imperative is for each of those different types of engagements.
Yeah, I appreciate your last point here because as an organization that is very interdisciplinary in our approach, and we're striding, a couple of leadership development area with diversity, equity, and inclusion and well-being, we're faced with that all the time. But I also believe very strongly in that collaboration spirit of doing the right thing rather than feeling, well, I have the ability, I feel I have the skills, I care about this issue, I can do this, rather than instead going to source the best person you can get that actually specializes in that, and in bringing that person on board as a form of a partnership or collaboration, which is really what CGL intends to do going forward in the work. Switching just a little bit into more details, can you give us some details, some examples of maybe of the needs of interventions that companies or individuals have asked you to address in the last 8 months, to give people an idea what are really asking, what are we dealing with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for a number of companies, they don't know, frankly, where to start. And so for us, it's about diagnosing what's there. So, if you go to a doctor and just say, give me medicine, the doctors, if they're ethical, it's going to say, well, I need to understand your history, your family history, your medical history, and we need to see what physical condition you're in. So we've spent a lot of time with clients, some frankly just diagnosing what their cultural baseline is and what their current state of readiness is. We've done gap analyses to see where they are. So that's some of the work. We've also done some work with senior leaders because our approach and our attitude is if your leaders don't get coaching, they will, whether they intend to or not, they will subvert the process.
Yeah.
So I want to make sure that all the leaders are aligned, that they understand what their gaps are. Do they understand what diversity means? And do they also understand equity, inclusion, and belonging? Because those words are just as important, if not more important, than the first. Do they have safe space to ask questions? Because a number of leaders, particularly if they're, let's say, white, cisgender, or men, or just inexperienced in this area, and that's not limited to people who are white or people who are cisgender or people who are male. If they don't have the space to ask questions, then how are they going to learn and grow? And some of the leaders are walking on eggshells because they're afraid of saying the wrong thing. We've done a number of trainings. So we do anti-racist training. We've done white supremacy training. We've done implicit bias. There's been less demand for implicit bias because as we talk about, for example, racism, there's a lot of racism that's quite explicit. And, over the past, I would say, 5 years, implicit bias training has been kind of the hot topic and the hot product for people to buy, the good service, because I think it's anti-racism light. It doesn't really dig in a little bit deeper to help people understand how their behaviors are consciously creating a culture of exclusion. We've done interventions and mediations between different groups. We've helped to do healing circles, which I have a lot of experience in doing, not only from T group training, but also from my background as a lawyer and also doing mediation. We have looked at existing policies. We've helped to revise policy statements. We've helped to look at employee manuals and handbooks. Um, it's a variety of different things. And we've also worked, a lot of this work too, that I should be very clear, has happened virtually all over the world. So we've been in Italia, we've been in Singapore, we've been in the Netherlands, we've been in France, we've been in the UK, we've been in Central and South America, we've been in East Africa. So it's a global conversation. And I think that, our attitude is we meet the client where they are and tell them what they need. But what we do is to say, wherever we enter, we have to have a long-term plan. Once again, going back to the medical metaphor, if a patient comes into the hospital, you want to make sure that there's a long-term sustainability plan and holistic plan for their well-being. So you're not just looking at the doctor or the general practitioner. There should also be a nutritionist. There should be a dietitian. There should be someone who is involved in their rehabilitation. So there should be a holistic model when you're looking at doing this work. And I think that's what's allowed us to be pretty successful.
Yeah, thanks for that metaphor. It's pretty powerful, so simple and yet powerful, because when you're concerned about your life and you want to understand what is going on, you are more prone to say, yeah, let's find out, let's run a series of tests and let's find out what is causing this. And yet, as a leader of an organization, sometimes that isn't necessarily the mindset or the focus. Is it also fair to say that the sort of other elephant in the room right now is the economic and financial conditions of everyone, right? Facing so many cuts and having to think about how to survive, that perhaps they are slowed down by their approach because spending time and money on assessing organizational culture gaps and all those analysis that is what's stopping them.
Well, I don't want to deny that that's a factor. And I see these issues as key to their survivability. So if you work in as we all do in a global marketplace, if you're not addressing these, and whether it's today or several years from now, you run the risk of being irrelevant.
Yeah.
So it's just a matter of whether you want to die, quote unquote, the slow death, or you want to have a more long-term prognosis. Not to use such morbid terms, but that's really the reality. So um, companies have, I think, it's all about doing work in phases. And so we certainly have said to clients, we don't have to do everything now. You probably shouldn't do everything now. There are things that have to be sequenced. There are things that you have to make sure your workforce is prepared for. There are things that you have to make sure that you understand. So let's think about what that budget is, and then let's think about what we can do to help you based on the package that you have available and based on what you can, and use that as a way of helping people to survive and helping the companies to operate better and more successfully within this environment. Because when you're making personnel decisions, when you're thinking about what your mission is, when you're thinking about how do you develop community partnerships and how do you engage your workforce, all of those have diversity and equity and inclusion implications. So this is not work that you just do because when everything is well, and that's how traditionally this work has been. It's been seen as something that you do separate from OD, which is why we're very clear in our work that we are an organizational development firm. And one of the things that we help to do as part of helping the organization to grow and sustain itself is to be more culturally intelligent. So cultural intelligence is an outcome and it is a part of the OD process, although those are two different things. But we're not just doing diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging just for the sake of doing DEIB. They have a real tangible business function. And if people recognize that and they integrate that into their business model and align that with their values, then we're thinking, and they hopefully realize that they will have long-term success and they will be more successful now, particularly when these issues like COVID, racial reckoning, uh, presidential elections, all these sorts of things that we're dealing with right now, they will see less downturn and they'll actually be seen as a model employer during these times of crises.
Yeah. Yeah, this was the $1 million insight. Just I think it will be useful for a lot of the leaders and organization that are thinking about doing the right thing on how to do it and what to prioritize. Because you said it, how do you want to die of a slow death? You have a choice, and the critical choice you have to make it is now. So I'm going to change a little bit the pace so that we maybe interact a little bit with the audience. We do have another question, but we'll probably leave it for last. But I want to invite everyone who's listening and logged in to unmute yourself or raise a hand, and then we'll unmute you to ask any question to Joel that might have come up during this brief discussion, and or contribution from your own experience, knowing that some of you guys are sitting in very far away places.
And I'm sure one of the questions that might be asked too, Antimo, is where you got your shirt from. So we'll allow for that question as well. So
I will think of the name in the back and then I'll tell you.
All right, wonderful, wonderful.
I'll jump in with a question that came up just as a quick one as a facilitator, and then I'll move it out to everyone. What I've encountered is this desire, I think, for a lot of folks to do a one size fits all approach to these trainings, without realizing, as you so wisely said, that there's a need for healing within organizations already, and a very legitimate, not even lack of patience. People are done having the conversation, in the BIPOC community. And just to be transparent, I'm Native American and Brazilian, so I'm part of that community, and I totally get what you're saying. How do you handle when you come into an organization, not only illuminating the fact that healing needs to be part of it, but that the approach is not going to be a one size fits all approach?
I think that's a great question. I think stressing to them. So I'm going to take a step back. So I'm sure many of you have heard this acronym VUCA. It's not a soft drink, anything like that, but VUCA being in English, it's volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And forgive me for not knowing exactly where that acronym came from, but we're hearing it more in the social landscape, particularly with those of us who do a lot of OD work, which recognizes that we're in a world of increasing change. We want people to be adaptable. And so what we share with our clients is the fact that if you're going to do this work well, you have to be adaptable, which means that you have to be creative. You have to be able to have a high risk tolerance. You have to be able to understand that in the moment, in the short term, after you perhaps implemented something, you may have to do something different. There may be some world events that have disrupted, um, the current landscape. So you may have to make quick adjustments. You may have to rethink your whole strategy. And in doing so, I think helps them to understand that there's not a one size fits all approach. What works in one part of the world, it works with one particular group, what works with one particular industry or organization is not always going to work. And I think that's the challenge, frankly, that we have with leadership. So my graduate study is in leadership, and one of the things that I'm always pressing my students to do and always talking to my clients about is the fact that leadership does not offer you a script. Leadership offers you an opportunity, and the opportunity comes from listening and being empathetic, and then knowing when to make decisions, but making sure that you have data points from all the engaged and all the affected people involved. And that means that there's not something that we can just say to you, well, if you just do this, then this. It doesn't work that way. And I even stopped using the term best practices, although you might be able to find some video of me using it recently, so don't hold against me. Because what's best for one industry and one group does not necessarily apply to other industries and to other organizations. So suggested practices, because of course we want organizations to be agile and flexible enough, but also be responsive to what they see, and to recognize that we do have to have a multidisciplinary and a global approach. And by the very nature of having a global and multidisciplinary approach, it means that there are going to be some things that may work here and some things that don't work here. Some of the work that we do, frankly, is around, just as an example, LGBTQ inclusion. Well, the way that I approach LGBTQ inclusion in, let's say, in London is going to be vastly different than how I approach it in Beijing. So you have to understand that and recognize that. And I think a lot of those concerns, Marcia, are born from a place of wanting to get something done because these issues have been neglected, and not really understanding that in order to do something that's really in the best interest of your people, you're going to have to really dig down and really think and strategize and ideate and talk to people. And that's not what some people want to do. They just want to slap a band-aid on the solution and say, okay, or the problem and say we're done. And that's not showing good leadership. So what I ask people all the time is, are you in this for the moment or for the long haul? Are you here to check a box, or are you here to take care of your people and to safeguard against further incursions into, their psychological safety, et cetera, et cetera. So um, it happens quite a bit, but I think I have seen more companies that have recognized that this work is going to require some adjustments, some adaptability, and some flexibility on their part, because we can't, not only because of the nature of their organization, but we can't predict what things are, and these issues are constantly emerging. Just 5 years ago, I wasn't hearing Latinx. Now we're hearing Latinx as part of the lexicon. So these and issues, as people get their voices and communities are becoming more visible, there's so much for us to learn. And even I, as someone who's been doing this work for over, nearly 25 years, I'm always coming to it, as I do with my yoga practice, as though it's the first time. So there has to be some humility. And I think if we build humility into the practice, and people will realize that based on the vagaries of the market, but based on the emerging sensibilities of the people we work with and work for, things are going to shift, and we have to be open to a different approach that may be customizable during the engagement itself, not just at the beginning, and certainly not just at the end.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
you've summarized and addressed this beautiful, compelling words. But then the other one is that needs to be mentioned is having the courage and the boldness to do something about it. We all understand. We can read these things and we understand them perfectly. But then, how do you go against the grains or whatever bureaucracy you're faced with to take that bold action, courageous action, and do something about it because you're living a life of purpose and you're aligned with that? So that's, I think, what we need more and more to talk about and to encourage to show. I'm going to turn it into Marcia because I see a couple of very good
Yes,
questions in
we
the
do.
chat line, and I know that you were addressing those.
Right. And I also want to reflect the appreciation around speaking to it as a process, you know, not as a box to check, but as a real process. And I do concur with that, there's at least in the United States, a very focused, I think, attitude of it's a problem, let me fix it, rather than it's a process, let me learn through it. And all of us are part of that process, right? That's, and, I come from the world of I'm a therapist, and so that's where we live, but it's like to do that in business, I think it's coming around to being a very real and necessary skill to have. So I applaud that you integrate that. Let me read a couple of the questions that we have in chat, and then I do want to open it up so that others can also do chat or pipe in, but I just want you to know what's on people's minds. From Bert, here's one question. We have two. Bert says, I see a lot of conflation between intercultural work and DEIB work, with intercultural professionals claiming to quote unquote know DEIB work. What has been your observation experience with that? So hold that for a minute. I'll give you the second one, and
All
then
right.
so that you know what's kind of on people's minds.
All right.
And I'm curious about the second one too. Elizabeth says she has a kid in the background, which is why she's off screen right now. So we get it, Elizabeth. My participation here is based on amplifying the American Indian Alaska Native voice in corporate DEI initiatives. Yay, Elizabeth, I'm happy you're doing that. There are certain cultures that are more visible when talking about diversity issues. Can anyone speak to how you include the Native population along with other cultures? Thank you. So those are our two questions right now from the chat.
Wow, those are really great and deep questions. I'm going to go to the second one first, since it's top of mind. I think um, I'm going to speak to this current era right now, because one of the challenges, and I'm just going to be once again frank, what I've heard from some people is we support Black Lives Matter, and we're struggling to understand how to articulate other issues where there's a critical need. And I think if we understand, if we go back and we're talking about anti-racism, and I'm saying this, although it's fairly obvious to me, but it may not be as obvious to other people. And sometimes you have to say these things, but racism is not just a white, black, or a black issue. It's something that impacts a number of different communities. And so we have clients in Canada. So we spend a lot of time talking about the experiences of First Nations people and to talk about their experiences. And if we're talking about COVID, for example, here in the United States, obviously talking about how COVID has impacted. But I think it's important to make sure that you continue to use different examples and to highlight different experiences and make sure that it's broad based, but to do it in a way that is meaningful so that it doesn't feel like it's a diluted conversation. And I think even if you look at that phrase, Black Lives Matter, which I know has been so top of mind for so many of us, when we say Black Lives Matter, all Black Lives Matter, well, Black lives would also include, if we're thinking from an intersectional lens, those of us who have mixed heritage, because many African Americans also have Native American or Indigenous heritage, such as me. If we're talking about all Black Lives Matter, Afro-Latino. So you got to speak about that. You have to speak about those of us who are, like I said, multicultural. So that would include a lot of different issues related to Asian American, Pacific Islander, Native Hawaiian. So we mix things up. We don't focus just on African Americans and Blacks, because the issues, I think one of the things that needs to happen, particularly in these conversations, and I'm going to share a story that happened with a client. So we did a presentation. It's a very short story, just to introduce ourselves, because we were going to do a restorative justice practice for them. And one of the leaders, young person, millennial, was upset because she said, this speaks to white supremacy. And I said, oh, really? Caught me off guard. I said, tell me more, because this presentation is just for white people. And all of us understand restorative justice. And I said, as diplomatically as I could, well, that in of itself is an interesting assumption, because restorative justice is certainly not just for white people. And there are a number of issues and there's a number of opportunities for BIPOC people, or those of us who are identified as marginalized or underrepresented, to understand each other's stories. Because sometimes when we're talking about these issues, it is looking towards, let's say, those who are in the majority or those who have privilege, and assuming that I understand the journey of those who might be sitting at the table with me, who might be in the same caravan, but I've not really taken the time to say, oh, your experience is slightly different. So I think a lot more of that work has to be done, and making sure that people are prepared for the new reality, because the reality right now is 50%, at least in the US, I can't speak for other countries, but in the US, 50% of the people under the age of 18 are persons of color. I didn't say Black, persons of color. So if we want to prepare ourselves for the new reality, we also have to understand what that new reality looks like, which is not just Black or African American. And we know that the fastest growing and the largest ethnic minority in the United States right now is actually Latinx Hispanic. It's not African American. So there has to be a broader conversation that's being had, and we also have to make sure and think about when we're having these conversations who's not at the table. And oftentimes, in my experience, that's also the voice of those who are indigenous or First Nation or Native American or whatnot. So that's what we do. And so I think that question is a very timely one, just to make sure that we're not crowding people out of the conversation, that we're being as inclusive as possible. The first question, if I remember it, is around the interculturalism. Um, and
Would you like me to? I'll just
oh no, I
you got
remember it.
you
Yeah,
got
I
it
got
right.
it.
Go
Yeah.
for it.
Interculturalism was born out of the workplace dynamic where families were being moved across the world, and you had families or spouses and families. Sorry for the noise.
Okay.
Who had to become wanted to become acculturated or become aware of the new culture into which they were entering. And that's an important function. The problem with interculturalism is that it ignores systems and ignores structures. And so a lot of it that I've been privy to has been, well, if you go to France, you do this, or if you go to Brazil, you do this. If you come to the United States, these are the things that you should be aware of. But it is missing the systemic analysis. Where I think DEIB could have a greater focus in North America is to have actually a global mindset, because so many of these issues are global in nature. When we're talking about, for example, Black Lives Matter, which can be seen as a synonym for underrepresented people matter, these issues are implicated all across the world, and they play out differently. If you're in Southeast Asia, it plays out in terms of colorism, or in parts of Africa, or if we're talking about what's happening in Europe, we're seeing issues related to immigration. But the root and the nexus and the core of these issues is coming from the same place, but it's about making sure that we understand it differently. The intercultural piece is one where, once again, I think both camps could learn from each other, but it's also going to require having, once again, honest and candid conversations about the reason the world looks the way it does. The reason why we have, for example, in Italy, or the reason why we have the Western Europe looking the way it is not just because these were natural things. These are also social constructions, and they are informed by histories of oppression and colonialism and imperialism. And
Yep.
many people, frankly, are afraid to do that because it puts them in an uncomfortable position where they may have to talk about things where they're not accustomed to, and it may also cause them to think differently about income and their marketability and those sorts of things. But they are wildly different. And I think, though, if we're going to do this work meaningfully, we have to apply a global lens, and we have to be able to understand how these issues are issues that apply everywhere. And that doesn't mean talking about slavery. That means talking about how racism shows up in other places and what it looks like in those particular regions and in those particular cultures. So very different. And if we're going to talk about racism too, we have an interculturalism. We have to understand that a lot of how culture gets informed is also by these issues. And I've heard some people say, well, we just do culture work. I'm like, well, when have we ever had cultures that have not been influenced by ism? I mean, they're not mutually exclusive. I just find that to be a really interesting piece. Um, so there you have it.
Yeah,
Okay,
Yeah,
great.
fantastic.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, Antimo.
please jump
Yeah,
in.
go ahead, Farhan.
Sorry.
No.
Okay, Joe, thank you so much. I'm really enjoying this so far.
Thank you.
Um, just wanted to ask, I think this is the right moment to ask this question. So, what would you suggest to interculturalists who are willing to dive deeper into DEI? What should they do? Which direction should they follow? That would be my question, actually.
Which direction should they follow? That's a really good question. I think the first piece for me is around self-education and just looking at the history and the structures in place for their particular region. So once again, looking at the world and seeing it, but then asking the question of, well, how did we get to this place, and why does the world look the way it does? And knowing that these are not naturally occurring things, but these are based upon the machinations of governments and nation states and people and quote unquote their biases. So doing a historical analysis of what's there, and then using that historical analysis to understand why there might be different outcomes, and to being able to look at the structures wherever you might be, whether you're in India, whether you're in, once again, you're in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, whether you're in North America, whether you're in Central America, and understanding the structural piece. So much of the analysis is based on the personal and the interpersonal. And where I would love to see interculturalists go is look more at the institutional and look more at the structural or the systemic piece. And so there has to be more systemic analysis. And I think if you start there, then you will really have a good basis for understanding, okay, not only why things look the way they are, but what are the barriers and what are the different experiences that people may have that goes beyond just simply recognizing different norms and different cultural patterns and whatnot. I also want to take time to, because I believe I saw someone ask the question about the statistics. It's fairly easy to find that statistic about the US. The Pew Center is my go-to place. Not that I was paid to make a recommendation for the Pew Center, but they're my go-to place for getting good statistical research about demographic data. So, but that should be fairly easy to find out and to look for if you just do a Google search and talk about the emerging face of America. Um, it looks like me, it looks like Marcia, it looks like Antimo to some extent, but it's different than how how the narrative has been told and the mythology that has been given to us. And so it's different.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else from the audience that wants to either voice their opinion from their experience or ask another question?
I might ask another question if there's nobody else. Sorry. Is there anybody else?
I was going to make a comment, but you can ask
go
a
ahead,
question.
please. Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just kind of follow up about that interculturalist versus the DEI, DEIB. It kind of has to do with where you stop paying attention to people as well. If it's within the workplace context, it's like, okay, they're here. How do how do we navigate our differences within this context versus seeing the whole person, including patterns you see in their homes, their communities, and all those. I think the more of a comprehensive view or approach you have of who people are, who groups are, not just okay, how do we make this situation fair and balanced, but are we going to be concerned about the life and that live outside these walls of the workplace? And once you start to consider those, it's hard to just keep it at, here's your communication styles and here's your, learning styles and approaches. And it's hard to keep it at just those. It's more of, okay, what opportunities, what situations are they facing in the world in general that I don't face, right? And then from then on, the systematic differences come in a bit easier than if we're just looking within the workplace.
I think that's a really good point. Hey, Kwesi, how are you?
Hey.
And I'm seeing, new friends and whatnot. And I'd also say helping organizations to understand that given the soup and the stew in which we swim, in which we find ourselves, organizations help to replicate the existing culture. They're not immune from it. So when I was coming of age, which was a little while ago, not too long ago, but it was a little while ago at this point, I was told that you enter work and you focus strictly on work. So there was this dichotomy between your personal life and your professional life. And I'm so glad at some point, and possibly because of the changing nature of the workforce and the values that they brought with it, people started to say, well, this is not really working for us. And I don't ever think it actually worked for anybody, but that was what we were told. And I think that was a kind of a norm that was established for underrepresented groups. But this whole false dichotomy that, well, you check yourself at the door at 8 a.m., but then you pick up who your identity, your soul at 5 p.m. just doesn't work, because what we realize is that part of what gives us our intellectual and our social and cultural capital is who we are. When I'm coming in to do work, and I'm coming in even as an engineer, if I'm coming in and I'm doing work as a doctor, as I'm working as someone who's in marketing and whatnot, I have to employ all of my cultural capital in order to help and to reach and to deliver the services and the goods at the best way possible. So by telling people necessarily that they need to check that at the door, you're basically cutting them off from what makes them brilliant, what makes them wise, what makes them as successful as they can be. In addition to the fact too, that this dichotomy of that you just check yourself at the door has never existed for anyone. And the fact too, that the same ideas and phenomena and systems that exist outside of the workplace are oftentimes very much replicated and rebuilt within the workplace. And so that's why it's important to equate these points to make sure that we have a much broader lens when we talk about these different things.
And to add to that, the entire world right now is putting a very strong emphasis on well-being. That we've moved from wellness to well-being, from a concept that lived in the body to a concept that lives in the spirit, in the soul, and in the mind of people. And right now, with all of the problems that we're experiencing globe-wise, the grieving, the anxiety, the uncertainty, a person is always constantly checking in within the layers of themselves and say, is that being seen? Is that being validated? Is that being used? And so all of a sudden, well-being becomes a conversation about your multicultural levels of identity and your contribution that you make from each of those layers. And you know, it goes back to, do you check yourself out at the door? No, you actually don't. You bring in your full self, and hopefully leadership is going to become more sensitive to seeing what else, where are those layers, and please, you know, express them, teach us, show us, you know, put them in on the creative table and have them influence a process, a product, a service, all of that.
Mhm.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that I had actually referenced the Pew Research Institute information for a workshop I did recently on multicultural identity. So I was able to have that link pretty quickly. That's not the only thing they've been doing. They've been doing quite a bit of work on that. So that's in the chat box if people want to take a look at that. I'm also seeing that Chris Cartwright has put in some resources. There's also an organization called illuminative.org that has an incredible amount of research and focus on Native populations in the US. That it was the first comprehensive research project that surveyed individuals all the way to institutions, levels of government on how folks viewed Native Americans today. And the findings were pretty amazing. So how racism shows up for Native folks is invisibility. So to Joel's point, you know, it manifests differently, but it still exists within different populations. So just want to point that out in the chat box. So please take a look at those resources as well. We've got about 8 more minutes, which means the time went by so fast. And I feel like we're just starting to get into this conversation. So please, if you have questions, okay, I'm seeing Bert's kind of clarification of his question. So I'm just going to pop that out really quick. Unless Bert, you're here, so you can talk.
Yes.
Sandwich. There's no sandwich, so go ahead.
Sandwich, I've flossed my teeth and everything's fine. No, maybe to follow up, and this is the limitation of typing versus just speaking, is my issues. I understand the difference between IC and DIB, and I think we need to dive a bit more into that. My issues around, I come from the IC field, and over the past, 1 year, I've been more educating myself around the DIB field. I definitely see the overlaps, so certain similar competencies, et cetera, but there's such a vast difference as well. And I'm a bit frustrated to see so many IC professionals claiming they can work in the DIB field. Even LinkedIn, not understanding my background and sending me all these diversity and inclusion director officer jobs, et cetera, et cetera. These are very different. So I just wanted to hear maybe from Joelle, your take on that. Have you seen that in the field, that conflation of like, I see people who are like, oh yeah, let me do this DIB work, and then potentially not doing it the way, not addressing these key issues of power, privilege, and that kind of stuff.
You see them all the time. And I guess what I try to do, frankly, in any of these conversations is reduce the polarization a little bit and say, okay, how can we learn from each other? I mean, one of the things I do love about the IC community is helping people understand that culture is in everything and everything is in culture. So, and I didn't come up with that. My one of my mentors and a dear friend and colleague, Kelly McLeod-Shingen, is someone who helped to reinforce that for me. Because I do think that here at least in the US, in North American context, what I see a lot is people treating what they see as universal behavior as, they don't see it as cultural, they see it as acultural. And so I do think the IC lens has helped people to kind of take a step back and to really introduce some foundational concepts from it. And at the same time, to your point, Bert, yes, I see that all the time. When I travel, when I'm working with my colleagues abroad, where they're not understanding the systemic piece of it. So for them, when you're talking about such things as microaggressions or having conversations, they're just saying, well, this is just a cultural piece. I'm like, well, no, there's a difference. There's also power and privilege and prestige involved in this too. And if you don't do a power analysis, then you're not really analyzing the dynamic and the situation and the context properly. So that's where it becomes frustrating. So, I use it as an opportunity to try to talk to people and just to kind of give them some pointers so that they don't do harm. But I don't want to say it's a problem. It's just a consideration. And I think there's an opportunity for people to learn on all sides going forward.
Yeah.
Thank you.
We only have a few minutes left, but I also want to honor the fact that we have Sandy Fowler, and with such a great wisdom and experience in the field as a leader of CITAR USA. Sandy, don't mean to put you on the spot, but if you have anything to add, anything you want to share, you're more than welcome to open your mic.
Hi, Antimo. Thank you. I just put a comment into the chat because if Chris hadn't mentioned his article, I was going to, I was planning to. I'd like to go back 30 years, maybe 35. The first person I heard in CITAR, when it was just totally intercultural and relocation, mention power dynamics, that whole piece was Richard Brislam. Richard brought it up early on, and it was one of those things that people talked about, but really didn't do anything with. That has changed in CITAR because we really emphasize, I think, or we're trying to anyway, the fact that that CITAR really can be an intersection between DEI, social justice, intercultural. So what I have found over the recent years is that it's awfully easy to say that we're going to be that intersection. What's hard is that identifying, defining what that means, what it is. I think that conversations like this help a lot because things come up that are all part of it. It's not easy. It's a very complicated intersection. And I think that we have so much to learn from each other as we go forward, because the only way we're going to make a difference in the world is to figure out what this intersection is and make it work.
I think to that point, and it's good to see you, of course, Sandy. I want to encourage everybody here to go beyond the people who may be designated leaders and thought leaders and scholars on this area, to also make sure that you uplift and consult with writers, authors, thinkers who are of color or people who are underrepresented. Because so many times when I walk into these environments and have these conversations, there are people who are brilliant, and their ideas are obviously disseminated and promulgated to the multitude. And there are a number of thought leaders who come from places, the global South, who come from places that we have not typically honored, who have talked about a number of these same things. It's just that they didn't have the profile and the packaging, the presentation to get their words across and to share their wisdom. So I would also employ or ask all of us to dig a little bit deeper in terms of our research, our learning, and our scholarship to make sure that we're elevating those voices who have been talking about these things for quite some time. And that's one of the things that a number of us have been working on, to curate a list. And I know there's one out there. I just had to figure out where I got it from. But for example, my colleague, Natasha Aralaya, has developed one of those lists. And so it's just important for us to think about where we're getting our information from, and knowing that a lot of the OD, intercultural, global diversity experts that are out there, a lot of their work is also based upon the scholarship of other people whose names and whose legacies have not really been honored and valued.
I think there's a value to that, because a very important value, because even within multiculturalism, there are silent narratives, and it is extremely important that they're valued, they're brought up in collaboration, they're put on the podium. Everybody has a contribution to make. You don't have to be a particular authority in the field to make that contribution, because right now a lot of people are really acting from a very compassionate, passionate, and deep value for making a difference in the world. And there's a lot more resources than we think out there. And we should be starting to value them and put them on a podium.
Can I share a quick story before I know we have like 30 seconds. I
We
went to
won't get cut off. We won't get cut off. So
Okay.
yeah.
All right. So I remember going to an OD conference several years ago, and one of the questions I was asking me was like, well, who are the people that you respect? It's a very serious question, and I think we have to be multidisciplinary. I'm going to read as much from Edgar Schein as I'm going to read from Dr. King and from Malcolm X. I want to read from Fannie Lou Hamer as much as I'm going to read from Cesar Chavez or some of the other Nelson Mandela. I mean, so what I'm sharing with people is when we're talking about social justice and we're talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it doesn't always occur within the organization, but that doesn't mean that those concepts cannot apply to some of the change management that you're trying to do within organizations or within a particular context. So we have to have a broader lens to look at the men and women out there who've also led change in society and looking at some of the principles that they developed and that they use and utilize that could also be helpful for us and think about how do you overcome resistance? How do you deal with people not understanding culture, not understanding their power and their positionality? Those are things that are important too. So our teachers don't necessarily have to have a designated title or label or come from a designated industry. Our teachers, and that's the energy and the spirit in which I approach you all today, can come from a variety of different contexts. And so when we're thinking about doing this work, and particularly around having more of a systemic perspective, step outside of change management, OD, interculturalism, and look at people who have been change makers, because that's essentially what we're trying to do. At least that's what we're trying to do. I can't speak for everybody, but at Numos, our goal is to be change agents to create positive, sustainable change for the planet. And working within organizations is just one aspect of the work that we're doing.
Beautiful.
Great.
I almost feel like we can't add much more to that.
Exactly. I was going to say the same thing. The only thing that I have to share is where did I get the shirt? The shirt. I got it from a place. Well, the brand is called Stone Rose. And I remember I was in Miami when I bought it, but search for Stone Rose on the internet shirts, and that will lead to a whole bunch of different crazy shirts.
All right.
Thank you.
I'll ask for the Antimo discount too when I contact them.
There you go. Yeah, I am really not paid for doing that, but from the bottom of our hearts, this was an incredibly rich, insightful, thought-provoking conversation. It will be at some point made available to anyone as a resource on our website. Joel, thank you so much for carving the time out of your very, very busy schedule to make this happen. We are very delighted. And thank you for everyone who attended.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
It's such a
Antimo.
pleasure
Yes.
to know you.
Thank you. Thank you
It
so
was-
much. Do we get to email him?
Are you?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I just meant to ask, will we be able to get a copy of the chat transcript, because I know there
I'm
was
going to save that.
Yes, we
Okay.
will
Yeah,
have
I will
that.
save that as well. So we have all the resources. We'll send that out to folks as well that joined us today. And like Antimo said, we have resources on the CGL, culturalgloballabs.com. We actually have, speaking of hidden narratives, we did a live event with an intercultural company called Diferance in Brazil. So we are, I think, very interested in that topic and really bringing together voices that we haven't heard from. So this is really just a timely discussion, and we so appreciate it, Joel. Thank you so much.
Thank you and gratitude. All right,
Thank
be
you very
well.
much.
All right,
Thank
be well.
you. Thank you so much. And bye to everyone from Istanbul.
All right,
Yeah,
greetings. Have a good night.
bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.